close your eyes for a moment, just for a moment. Let the day fall away from your shoulders like a heavy coat you no longer need to wear. You are in a quiet room. The light is low. Perhaps there is a blanket draped across your lap or a cool pillow beneath your head. The air is still. The world outside has softened its edges, and now we are going to travel together. Not far, not fast. We are going to walk. We are going to walk across a mountain range, through the snow, through the thin, cold air, with an army that lived 2,500 years ago. We are going to do this slowly. There is no rush. The soldiers are not in a hurry either, or at least they try not to be. Because when you are climbing a mountain in winter, every step is a negotiation with gravity, with the cold, with the very air you breathe. And we have time. We have all the time in the world. Let me set the scene for you. Imagine a place that is not a place you would ever choose to go in winter. Imagine a spine of the earth, a backbone of rock and ice that runs across a vast, ancient land. The Zagros Mountains. They stretch like a great stone wall from the northwest of what we now call Iran, down to the southeast, dividing the high central plateau from the lowlands of Mesopotamia. In the summer, these mountains are fierce enough. The sun bakes the rock, the passes are narrow and treacherous, and the rivers run fast and cold. But in winter, they become something else entirely. They become a world of silence and whiteness, where the wind has a voice of its own, and where the snow does not fall so much as it descends, patiently, relentlessly, until the valleys are filled and the peaks are hidden and the path itself becomes a memory. And it is here, in this frozen world, that we find our soldiers. They are Persian soldiers. They belong to the army of the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian empire, a realm that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, from the deserts of Central Asia to the sands of Egypt. And their king was a man named Cyrus the Great, or perhaps his son Cambyses, or perhaps one of the later kings. The exact which does not matter for our story tonight. What matters is that these soldiers were on a march. They were crossing the Zagros Mountains in the dead of winter. They were going from the old capital, Pasargadae, or perhaps from the new one, Persepolis, toward the west, toward the ancient cities of Babylon and Susa, toward war or toward trade or toward the simple, necessary business of empire. Now, think about what that means. To march across a mountain range in winter, not in a jeep, not in a heated train, not in an airplane with a cup of coffee and a magazine, on foot, with horses, with pack animals, with supplies, with weapons that are heavy and cold to the touch, with woolen cloaks that soak up the damp and freeze into stiff boards in the night air, with boots that are not waterproof because waterproof was not a word they knew, with nothing but a fire at the end of the day and a handful of grain and the hope that the path would not disappear beneath the snow before they reached the other side. And yet they did it. They did it again and again, generation after generation. The Persian army was famous for its ability to move across difficult terrain. The Greek historians, who were often their enemies, would later write about this with a kind of grudging admiration. They would tell stories of Persian soldiers crossing deserts without water, marching through snowstorms without complaint, building bridges across rivers that seemed impossible to bridge. And the secret, if there was a secret, was not any single piece of technology or strategy. It was something quieter. It was knowledge. It was the knowledge of how to read the land, the knowledge of how to move through cold, the knowledge of how to breathe in thin air. Let us talk about that thin air for a moment. Because when you climb a mountain, even a low mountain, the air changes. It becomes lighter, thinner, harder to pull into your lungs. At sea level, every breath gives you plenty of oxygen. Your body is happy. Your muscles work without complaint. But when you climb higher, above 6,000 or 7,000 feet, the air becomes a miser. It gives up its oxygen grudgingly. Your heart beats faster. Your lungs work harder. Your head begins to ache. Your legs feel heavy, as though they are made of stone. And if you keep climbing, without giving your body time to adjust, you can become sick, dizzy, nauseous, confused. The soldiers of ancient Persia did not have a word for altitude sickness. They did not know about hemoglobin or oxygen saturation or pulmonary edema, but they knew the feeling. They knew that after a certain height, the world became strange. The sounds seemed muffled. The colors seemed dim. The mind drifted. And they knew that the only way to survive it was to go slowly, to rest, to breathe deeply and wait. And so they did. They went slowly. They climbed in stages. They would ascend a little way, then stop for a day or two, letting their bodies adjust, letting the thin air become a little less strange. They would build small fires, not for warmth, but for the comfort of the flame, for the way it made the darkness feel less vast. They would huddle together, soldier against soldier, sharing the warmth of their bodies, listening to the wind that never seemed to stop. And in the morning, they would rise again, stiff and cold, and they would continue. Let us consider the snow itself. The snow in the Zagros Mountains is not the soft, fluffy snow of a winter postcard. It is a dry, crystalline snow, like fine sugar, that does not pack well and does not melt easily. It drifts. It fills the valleys and covers the passes and transforms the landscape into a white ocean with no waves. And beneath that white surface, there are rocks and crevices and drop-offs that can swallow a man whole. The Persians knew this. They knew that the snow was a liar. It made the path look smooth. It made the ground look level. And so they walked carefully. They tested each step with the tip of a spear or a staff. They sent scouts ahead, men whose eyes were sharp and whose instincts were older than memory, to find the safe way. And they followed slowly, one step at a time, in a long line that snaked across the white hillside like a dark thread, stitching the mountain to itself. There is a story I want to tell you. It comes from the historian Herodotus, who was not always reliable, but who knew how to tell a tale. He writes about the Persian king Xerxes, who led a massive army across the Hellespont, a narrow strait of water on a bridge of boats. But that is a different crossing, a different story. For our story tonight, we turn to a lesser-known passage, a quiet moment in the march of another Persian army. This army was led by a general named Artafernes, or perhaps it was a satrap, a governor, whose name we have forgotten. He was tasked with moving a contingent of soldiers from the eastern provinces to the west. It was late winter. The passes were all but closed. The local guides told him it was impossible. They said the snow was too deep, the air was too thin, the winds were too fierce. They said wait until spring. Wait until the melting. Wait until the road reveals itself again. The general did not wait, because empires do not wait, because the business of rule does not pause for a snowstorm. And so he gave the order, and the army began to climb. Now, I want you to imagine the scene. Picture the soldiers as they leave the lowlands, the last village, the last warm hearth, the last familiar face. They are wrapped in layers of wool and felt. Their boots are bound with leather straps. They carry their own provisions because there are no supply trucks, no airdrops, no support vehicles. A bag of dried meat, a bag of grain, a water skin that will freeze solid in the night unless it is kept close to the body. And they begin to walk. The road at first is just a road, a dusty track winding upward. But soon the dust becomes mud, and the mud becomes slush, and the slush becomes snow. And the snow deepens inch by inch, hour by hour, until it is up to their ankles, then their knees, then their thighs. They walk in silence. There is nothing to say. The wind steals their words before they are spoken. The cold numbs their lips. They walk with their heads down, watching the feet of the man in front of them, placing their own feet in his footprints, because that is the easiest way. The snow has smoothed out the rough terrain, but it has also hidden the dangers. A misstep, a slide, a fall, and a soldier could disappear into a ravine, swallowed by the white silence, and no one would hear him call. At night, they dig. They dig into the snow to create shelters. They build walls of snow blocks, and they lay branches across the top, and they crawl inside these small, dark caves. The snow is a good insulator. It traps the heat from their bodies. It keeps the wind away. Inside, they light a small lamp, fueled by oil, and the flame is enough to warm the air by a few degrees. They eat their cold meal. They share a sip of water. They sleep huddled together, and in the morning, they dig themselves out and continue. This went on for days, 7 days, 10 days. I do not know the exact number because the records are vague, and the details have been worn smooth by time like stones in a river. But it was long enough for the soldiers to lose count, long enough for the days to blur into each other, long enough for the mountain to become not a place they were crossing, but a state of being, a condition of existence. The cold was not something they felt anymore. It was just the air. The snow was not something they saw. It was just the ground. The thinness of the air was not a discomfort. It was just the way breathing was. And then one morning, something changed. The wind stopped. Not entirely, but it softened. The sky, which had been a flat, white lid for days, began to show cracks of blue. The snow became shallower, and the soldiers realized, with a gradual, weary dawning, that they were nearing the top. The pass, the highest point of their journey. The place where the mountain opened up and offered a view of the other side. Now, I have stood on the top of a high pass in winter, not the Zagros, but a different range, a different continent. And I can tell you what it feels like. It feels like you have entered a different world. The air is so clear that it hurts to breathe. The silence is so deep that you can hear your own pulse. The horizon stretches out in every direction, a sea of white peaks and blue shadows, and you feel very small and very large at the same time. You feel like you are standing on the roof of the world, and also like a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. For the Persian soldiers, reaching the pass was a moment of both triumph and terror. Triumph because they had made it. They had climbed through the worst of it. The hardest part was behind them, but terror because now they had to go down. And going down is in some ways more dangerous than going up. The snow is slick. The slope is steep. A fall could mean a broken leg, a broken neck, a slide into a crevasse. And the air on the other side might not be any easier. They did not know what awaited them in the western valleys. They only knew that they could not stay here, on this exposed ridge, with the wind cutting through their cloaks and the sun reflecting off the snow and blinding them. So they paused, they rested, they shared what little food they had left. They looked out at the vast, white expanse before them, and they breathed. And then, one by one, they began the descent. Let me describe the feeling of descending a mountain in deep snow. It is a strange, unsteady motion. You lean back, trying to keep your weight from carrying you forward too fast. You dig your heels in, but the snow gives way. You slide, stop, slide again. You use a staff or a spear to brace yourself. Your thighs burn, your knees ache. Your toes, if they are still warm enough to feel, press against the front of your boot with every step. The world tilts downward, and you have to fight the urge to just let go, to sit down and slide all the way to the bottom, because that would be foolish, because you do not know what lies beneath the snow, because a rock or a tree stump could end your journey in an instant. But the Persians were disciplined. They had walked this kind of ground before. They knew how to descend. They moved in a zigzag pattern, cutting across the slope, switching back and forth, controlling their speed. They stayed close together, not so close that a fall would take out the whole line, but close enough that they could help each other if someone slipped. They talked to each other, not in words, but in grunts and gestures, the language of tired men who understand each other without speech. And as they descended, the air began to change. It thickened. It grew richer. Each breath felt like a small gift. The snow began to thin. The rocks began to reappear. And then, after hours or days of downward travel, the first trees, stunted, wind-bent trees, clinging to the slope, but trees nonetheless. A sign that the world was returning to itself. A sign that the mountain was releasing them. And as they descended, the air began to change. It thickened. It grew richer. Each breath felt like a small gift. The snow began to thin. The rocks began to reappear. And then, after hours or days of downward travel, the first trees, stunted, wind-bent trees, clinging to the slope, but trees nonetheless. A sign that the world was returning to itself. A sign that the mountain was releasing them. But the mountain does not release anyone all at once. It lets them go slowly, reluctantly, like a hand unclenching one finger at a time. The snow became patchy, then muddy, then wet. The rocks turned from white to gray to brown. The air grew heavier, wetter, and the soldiers coughed, unused to the moisture after so many days of dry cold. Their lungs ached with the effort of breathing this thick, humid air. It felt strange, almost wrong, like drinking water after a long fast. They had to remind themselves that this was normal. This was the world below. This was where they belonged. The first village they reached was small, just a handful of mud brick houses huddled together against a hillside. The villagers saw them coming from a long way off, a line of dark figures descending out of the snow line, and they did not know what to make of them. Soldiers were not uncommon in these parts, but soldiers coming from the mountain in winter, that was something else. That was a thing of legend, a thing only gods and madmen would attempt. And so the villagers waited, watching, as the Persians stumbled into their settlement. The general, whoever he was, went first. He walked up to the village headman, a wizened old man with a face like a dried apple, and he asked for water. Not food, not shelter, not fire, just water. The headman nodded and gestured to a well. The general drank, and then he sat down on a stone, and he did not move for a long time. The soldiers followed, each one taking his turn at the well, each one collapsing onto the ground afterward, too exhausted to speak, too tired to care about anything except the feeling of water in their mouths and the solid earth beneath them. The villagers did not know what to do with these men. They brought out bread, flat and hard, and cheese, and dried figs. They lit fires, though the soldiers did not seem to want them at first. They just lay there, staring at the sky, breathing. The children of the village crept closer, curious, staring at the strange armor, the unfamiliar faces, the way these men moved so slowly, so heavily, as if they were still carrying the weight of the mountain on their backs. One soldier, a young man from somewhere in the eastern satrapies, I do not know his name, sat apart from the others. He had lost a friend on the crossing, not to a fall, not to the cold, but to something quieter. The friend had simply stopped walking one day. He had sat down in the snow, and he had not gotten up. The young soldier had tried to rouse him, had shouted at him, had shaken him, but the friend only smiled and said something that the wind carried away. And then he closed his eyes, and the column moved on. That was how it was. That was how the mountain took its toll. With drama, not with a scream, but with a quiet stillness, a surrender, a letting go. And now, in this village, the young soldier sat and watched the fire and did not speak, because he was not sure what words could hold the weight of what he had seen. The general let them rest for 2 days. 2 days of sleeping, of eating, of letting their bodies remember what it was like to be warm. 2 days of watching the snow on the peaks above them, so distant now, so unreal, as if it belonged to a different world. And then he gave the order to move on. There was still a war to fight, or a province to govern, or a message to deliver. The business of empire did not wait for grief, But before they left, the general did something unexpected. He went back to the village headman and gave him a small pouch of silver coins. "Payment," he said, "for the bread and the cheese and the water." The headman tried to refuse, but the general insisted. He said, "Take it. You helped us when we had nothing." And the headman took it, and he bowed, and he watched the soldiers march away down the valley, still weary, still scarred, but alive. I like that detail. It is a small thing, a gesture of gratitude in the midst of a campaign that was probably brutal and unforgiving. But it tells me something about the general, and about the army, and about the kind of men who could cross a mountain in winter. They were not just soldiers. They were people. They carried silver coins and dried meat and memories of lost friends. They felt the cold and the thin air and the ache in their bones. They knew what it was to be afraid, and they went anyway. Now, you might be wondering why I am telling you this story. Why, on this quiet night, in this warm room, with the rain tapping against the window, or the wind rustling the leaves outside, why am I taking you back to a mountain pass in ancient Persia, to soldiers who have been dust for 2,000 years? I suppose I am telling it because I find it soothing. I find it soothing to think about the long, slow march of history, the way it grinds on, indifferent to our small concerns. I find it soothing to think about men who faced something impossible and did not turn back. I am not saying they were heroes. I am not saying they were wise. They were probably frightened and cold and miserable, just as you or I would be. But they kept walking. One step, then another, then another. And eventually, they reached the other side. There's a lesson in that, though I am not sure what it is. Maybe it is that the hardest things are often the simplest. You just put one foot in front of the other. You just keep going. The mountain does not care about your plans or your fears or your regrets. It only cares about the next step. And if you take that step, and then the next, and then the next, you will find yourself somewhere else. Not because the mountain has become easier, but because you have become stronger. Or perhaps not stronger, just more accustomed. The air is still thin. The snow is still deep. But you have learned to breathe in a different way. The Persians knew this. They learned it on every campaign, every crossing, every long march through deserts and forests and mountains. They learned it in the heat of summer and the cold of winter. They learned it so deeply that it became a part of them, a memory carried in their bones. And when they finally reached their destination, when they stood in the fertile valleys of the West, they did not boast about what they had done. They did not carve inscriptions into rocks. They simply set up their tents and lit their fires and prepared for whatever came next. The mountain was behind them. That was enough. I think about that when I am facing something difficult. I think about the Persian soldiers, their heads down, their feet following the footprints of the man in front of them. I think about the thin air and the blinding snow, and the way they kept moving even when every part of them wanted to stop. And I remind myself that I do not have to see the summit. I do not have to know how long it will take. I only have to take the next step. But let me return to the story, because there is more to tell. The army that crossed the mountain did not disappear into history. They went on to fight battles, to build roads, to collect taxes, to do all the ordinary and extraordinary things that soldiers do. Some of them survived the war and returned home. Some of them did not. Some of them settled in the western provinces, married local women, raised children who spoke Persian and Aramaic and the languages of their new homeland. Some of them forgot the mountain, or tried to, but I suspect that on cold winter nights, when the wind howled and the snow piled up against their doors, they remembered. They remembered the feel of the thin air in their lungs. They remembered the silence. They remembered the friend who sat down and did not get up. And they were grateful for the warmth of the fire, the weight of a blanket, the sound of a child laughing. That is the thing about hardship. It does not leave you. It stays with you, a quiet companion, a shadow at the edge of your vision. But it also gives you something. It gives you perspective. It gives you the ability to see the small comforts, the ordinary joys, the simple grace of a bowl of hot soup on a cold day. The Persians, after their mountain crossing, must have felt that. They must have looked at a plain, flat road and thought, "This is easy." They must have looked at a warm meal and thought, "This is enough." I do not know if the general ever crossed another mountain. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he spent the rest of his life marching from one province to another, always facing new obstacles, new passes, new winters. Or perhaps he retired to a quiet estate and tended his garden and told his grandchildren stories about the time he led an army through the snow. I like to imagine the latter. I like to imagine him sitting in the shade of a tree, a cup of wine in his hand, his grandchildren gathered at his feet, and his voice slow and deliberate as he tells them about the cold and the wind and the way the snow looked like a sea of white. And the grandchildren would shiver and pull their cloaks tighter, even though it was a warm day, and they would ask him, "Were you scared?" And he would pause, and he would think, and he would say, "Yes, but I did it anyway." And that is the heart of the story, I think. Not the strategic brilliance, not the logistical achievement, but the simple, stubborn act of continuing. The Persian soldiers crossed the mountain not because they were superhuman, but because they were human. They were afraid. They were tired. They were hungry. They were cold. And they kept walking. There is another detail I should share. It comes from a different source, a fragment of a letter or a diary. I cannot remember which. It describes the moment when the army finally reached the bottom of the pass and saw the valley below. The writer says that one of the soldiers, a man who had been silent for the entire descent, suddenly began to laugh. He laughed and laughed, a wild, broken sound, and the others looked at him, and then they started laughing too. Not because anything was funny, but because they had made it. Because the tension of the last days finally snapped. Because the world, which had been so narrow and white and silent, suddenly opened up into green and brown and the noise of a river. And they laughed until they cried, and then they cried until they laughed again, and then they fell silent, and they just stood there, looking at the valley, breathing. That image stays with me. The laughter of exhausted men, raw and unguarded. It is not the laughter of triumph. It is the laughter of relief. It is the sound of a held breath finally released. I think that is closer to the truth of the crossing than any heroic statue or epic poem. The truth is that they were tired, they were broken, they were barely holding on, and they made it anyway. Now, let me bring this back to you, here in the quiet of your own room, sipping tea or lying in bed, the night settling around you like a blanket. Perhaps you are facing your own mountain. Perhaps it is a deadline, a health concern, a relationship, a decision you have been avoiding. Perhaps it feels impossible, too high, too steep, the air too thin. I am not going to tell you that you can do it. I do not know your mountain. I do not know your strength. But I can tell you about the Persians. I can tell you that they kept walking. I can tell you that they did not stop. And I can tell you that, when they reached the other side, they laughed. Maybe that is enough. Let me continue a little further. The army, after resting in the valley, marched on to their destination. I will not bore you with the campaign details, the sieges and skirmishes, the politics of the court. Those are stories for another night. But I will tell you that years later, a traveler passed through that same mountain pass. It was summer, and the snow was gone, and the path was easy. The traveler stopped at the same village, and he asked about the crossing. An old woman, her face lined with age, told him the story. She said she remembered the soldiers. She remembered their silence, their weariness, the way they drank from the well as if they had never tasted water before. She said that, for years afterward, the villagers would find small objects in the snow when the melt came. A broken sandal, a coin, a piece of leather strap. The mountain had not let go of everything at once. It had held onto these small things, releasing them slowly, one spring at a time, as if remembering the men who had passed through. The traveler wrote about this in his journal. He said that the objects were like gifts from the mountain, reminders of the passage, tokens of the lives that had been lived and lost and carried on. He said that he picked up a coin, worn smooth by ice and time, and he put it in his pocket. And he thought about the soldier who had dropped it, perhaps reaching for it, perhaps not even noticing, his mind on other things. And he thought about the long chain of steps that had led that soldier to that mountain, and the long chain of steps that had led him there in turn. And he felt a connection, a thread stretching across centuries, binding them together. I have a similar feeling when I think about this story. I am not a soldier. I have never crossed a mountain pass in winter. I live in a world of central heating and supermarkets and roads that are plowed when the snow falls. But I have felt the thin air of fear. I have felt the weight of a long journey. I have known what it is to be tired in a way that goes beyond the body. And I have found, in the small act of reading about a Persian army, a kind of comfort. They walked so I could sit here and wonder about them. Their steps echo into my quiet room. And now, your own steps take you through this night. Perhaps you are drifting toward sleep. Perhaps the words are growing soft, the edges blurring. That is all right. Let them blur. Let the story settle around you like snow falling on a quiet slope. The Persians are still walking, somewhere in time, their breath misting in the cold, their feet finding the path. They do not know about you. They do not know about me. But they are walking anyway, and that is enough. I will leave you here at the edge of the valley with the sound of a river in the distance. The soldiers are setting up camp. The fires are being lit. Tomorrow they will march again. Tonight they will sleep, and the mountain will stand guard over them, silent and white. And perhaps in your own sleep, you will dream of snow and thin air, and you will find that you are walking too, and that the steps are not as hard as you feared. The mountain gives way, the pass opens, and you step through into the quiet of the other side. Good night, sleep well. And if you dream of mountains, let them be gentle, let them be kind, and let the Persian soldiers walk beside you, their footsteps soft, their laughter faint, their company a comfort in the dark. You might think that the story ends there, with the soldiers asleep by the fires and the mountain standing guard. But the mountain has a way of holding onto stories, of releasing them slowly, like the small objects the villagers found. And there is another crossing, another army, another set of footsteps that I want to tell you about. It is not a Persian army this time, but a Roman one. And yet the details feel so familiar that I wonder if all armies, across all ages, face the same mountain in their own way. The Roman legions, you see, were not strangers to high passes. They had their own Alps, their own Apennines, their own icy ridges that had to be crossed in the dead of winter. But there is a particular crossing in the year that we might call 53 before the Common Era that speaks to the same human truth we have been circling. A Roman general named Crassus was marching east toward the land of the Parthians, and he had to cross the Taurus Mountains. The Taurus Range is not as high as the Caucasus, but it is old and worn and treacherous, with passes that vanish under snow and reappear in the spring like ghosts. Crassus was a wealthy man, one of the richest in Rome, and he had an army of 40,000 men, 40,000 pairs of feet, 40,000 mouths to feed, 40,000 sets of eyes that looked up at the white peaks and felt a cold dread settle in their stomachs. He had hired guides, of course, local men who knew the paths. But one of those guides was a traitor, a man loyal to the Parthians, and he led the army into a trap, not an ambush in the pass itself, but a deception. He told Crassus that the way was clear, that the snow was shallow, that the mountain would yield. And so the legions marched into a dead end, a narrow gorge where the walls rose sheer on either side, and the snow deepened with every step. I imagine the centurions, the hardened veterans, looking at the sky and realizing they had been fooled. I imagine the whispered curses, the muttered prayers to gods who seemed far away. And I imagine Crassus, the general, sitting on his horse with his purple cloak pulled tight, staring at the white wall ahead and feeling the first stirrings of panic. He had crossed mountains before, but never one that seemed to swallow men whole. The army halted. The scouts came back with grim reports. The pass was blocked. They would have to turn back, find another route, lose days, lose time. And time was something Crassus did not have. But here is the part that stays with me. The soldiers did not mutiny. They did not burn the camp or kill the guide. They simply turned around in good order and began the long march back down the mountain. They did it without complaint, or at least without open complaint, because they were Romans, and that was what Romans did. They obeyed, they endured, they survived. And when they finally found the true pass, 3 days later, they crossed it without fanfare, without celebration, just the quiet shuffle of sandaled feet in the snow. I tell you this story because it shows the same stubborn persistence, the same resilience, but with a different flavor. The Persians laughed when they reached the valley. The Romans probably just saluted and built a camp. They were not given to public displays of relief. They kept their emotions locked away behind the discipline of centuries. But I wonder, in the quiet of the night, when the fires burned low and the sentries were alone with their thoughts, how many of them let a tear freeze on their cheek? How many of them thought of home, of wives and children, of the warm hearth they might never see again? There is a letter preserved on a scrap of papyrus from a Roman soldier stationed in the east. He wrote to his mother, or perhaps to his sister, and he said, "We crossed a mountain today. It was cold. I thought of you. That is all." 5 words, scratched in ink that has faded to the color of old tea. But those 5 words carry more weight than any general's speech. They carry the weight of a human heart, beating in the thin air, choosing to keep beating. And now, let me bring this back to you in the quiet of your own room, perhaps with a blanket pulled up to your chin, perhaps with a cat curled at your feet. The night is still. The world outside is sleeping. And I want you to imagine, if you will, that you are not alone, that the soldiers of centuries past are walking with you, that their footsteps, though faint, are real, that the mountain you face, whatever it is, has been faced before, not by supermen, not by heroes of legend, but by ordinary people who were cold and tired and scared and kept going anyway. There is a word in Persian, one that I stumbled upon while researching this story. It is not a word I can pronounce properly, but I can try. It is gali yak, which means ice flower. It refers to the delicate patterns that frost forms on a window on a winter morning. The Persians, the ancient ones, had a word for that. They noticed the beauty in the cold. They saw the flower even as the wind howled and the snow piled high. I like to think that, during their mountain crossing, some of them looked at the frost on their own beards and saw those ice flowers, that they paused for a moment to appreciate the strange elegance of their suffering. That is not a historical fact. I cannot prove it, but I believe it to be true in a deeper sense. Because humans, even in the worst of circumstances, find small ways to hold onto beauty. A soldier carving a piece of wood by the fire. A woman humming a lullaby to herself as she walks. A child picking up a stone that glitters in the sun. These are not grand gestures. They are quiet ones, but they are what keep us alive. Let me tell you about another small beauty. In the village at the foot of the mountain, the one where the army stopped to rest, there was a garden. Not a grand garden, but a simple one, with herbs and a few flowers that bloomed even in the cold. The soldiers, who had seen nothing but white for days, stood and stared at that garden as if it were a miracle. They touched the leaves. They smelled the thyme. They knelt to look at a single purple crocus pushing through the soil. And one of them, a young man from a farm in the lowlands, began to cry. He was not sad. He was overwhelmed by the green, by the proof that life continued beyond the snow. The villagers did not understand. They saw only a soldier weeping in their garden. But I think I understand. That soldier had been living in a world reduced to white and gray, to survival and silence. And then, suddenly, color returned. The world became more than cold. It became possible again. I want you to hold that image as you drift. A soldier kneeling in a garden, his armor dusty, his hands cracked, his eyes wet. And the purple crocus, small and stubborn, opening to the sky. That is the story. That is the truth. Not the grand narrative of empires and campaigns, but the quiet moment when a human being remembers what it means to be alive. And so, if you are still awake, if you are still here with me, let me tell you one more thing. There is a tradition among the mountain peoples of the region, a tradition that goes back centuries. When a traveler crosses a high pass, they leave a stone. They pile it on top of others, forming a cairn, a small monument to their passage. The stone is not heavy. It is not elaborate. But it is a mark, a sign that says, I was here, I crossed, I survived. The Persians, as they climbed, must have done this too. Perhaps they did not know it was a tradition. Perhaps it was just a habit, a way of keeping their hands busy, a way of leaving a piece of themselves behind. But the cairns still stand, scattered along the ancient routes, some tall, some collapsed, some covered in moss. And if you ever walk those paths, in summer when the snow is gone, you will find them. You can add your own stone. You can join the long line of travelers, stretching back to the beginning, who have said, I was here. That is the quiet invitation I want to leave with you. Not to cross a mountain yourself, not tonight at least, but to know that the crossing has been done, that the path exists, that others have walked it, and that their steps are still there, waiting for you if you ever need them. The night is deepening now. The hour is late. I can almost hear the clock ticking somewhere in the house, soft and regular, like a heartbeat. The Persians are far away, their fires long cold, their names forgotten. But their crossing remains. It is here, in the words I am saying, in the air you are breathing. It is a gift, a story, a small flame passed from hand to hand across the ages. And now I will stop, not because the story is over, but because it has become a part of you. It will settle into your sleep, into your dreams, into the quiet spaces of your mind. And when you wake, you may not remember the details, but you will remember the feeling of a path through the snow, of a breath drawn in thin air, of a step taken, and another step after that. So rest now. Let the mountain fade. Let the cold recede. Let the Persian soldiers walk into the mist of sleep. And know that, wherever you are not alone. The stones are piled. The path is marked. And the valley, when you reach it, will be waiting. Good night, friend. Sleep well. And may your dreams be gentle, like snow falling on a quiet slope. And yet, as the snow continues to fall in that quiet slope of your imagination, there is another story, one that I hesitated to tell, because it feels almost too quiet, too small for the scale of empires. But the night is long, and the hour is soft, and I think you might welcome it. It is about a single Persian soldier, not a general, not a king, just a man whose name we do not know, but whose journey has been preserved in a fragment of poetry that was never meant to be history. The poem was written centuries after the crossing by a Sufi poet who had heard the old tales from his grandfather. The grandfather had heard them from his own father, and so on, back through the generations, until the words had become worn and smooth, like stones in a riverbed. The poet wrote, "There was a man who carried a single almond in his pocket all the way across the mountain. When he reached the valley, he planted it, and the tree still stands. I have looked for that tree. I have read the accounts of travelers who claim to have seen it, an ancient almond tree with a twisted trunk, growing in a village that is barely a dot on the map. Some say it was planted by a soldier returning from the campaign of Cyrus. Others say it was planted by a woman waiting for her husband. But the poet's version is the one I hold on to. A soldier, cold and exhausted, carrying an almond, not for food, not for trade, but for the simple act of planting something in a place that had seen only snow and stone. That almond, if the story is true, would have been a small thing, no bigger than a thumbnail. It would have been dry and hard, easy to overlook. But the soldier kept it safe, perhaps in a fold of his tunic, perhaps pressed against his chest, where his own warmth could protect it. He did not eat it. He did not trade it. He carried it through the blizzards, through the thin air, through the days when his fingers went numb and his vision blurred. And when he finally reached the valley, he found a patch of earth, dug a hole with his hands, and placed the almond inside. Why would he do that? I have asked myself that question many times. He did not know if the almond would grow. He did not know if he would ever return to see it. He was a soldier, far from home, with no guarantee of survival. And yet he planted a tree. It is a gesture of hope so fragile, so irrational, that it almost seems foolish. But that is exactly why I believe it. Humans are not always practical. We do not always act in our own best interest. Sometimes we carry an almond across a mountain because we need to believe that something good will come of our suffering. I imagine that soldier sitting on a rock after the planting, his hands dirty, his breath still short from the descent. He looks at the small mound of earth, pats it gently, and then stands up to rejoin his unit. He does not tell anyone. He does not boast. He simply walks away, and the almond is left to the mercy of the soil, the rain, the sun. It is a secret, a prayer without words, and the tree grew. Slowly, stubbornly, it pushed through the earth, sent out roots, unfurled leaves. The villagers noticed it, as they notice all unexpected things. They watered it, perhaps, or protected it from goats. Or perhaps they ignored it, and it survived on its own. However it happened, the tree became a landmark. Travelers rested in its shade. Children climbed its branches. And every spring, when the almond blossoms appeared, pale pink and white against the brown hills, someone would remember the soldier who had carried it across the mountain. That is the kind of history I love most. not the dates and battles, but the small acts of tenderness that outlast the swords and the shields. The Persian army crossed the mountains with purpose, with strategy, with the weight of an empire on their shoulders. But one soldier crossed with an almond in his pocket, and that almond, in its quiet way, became as monumental as any victory. Let me tell you about another small act, one that has been recorded in a different kind of source. There is a carving, a relief on a stone wall in Persepolis, that shows a line of tribute bearers climbing a staircase. They carry gifts for the king, bowls, cloth, animals. Among them, carved in the same stone, is a figure who appears to be carrying nothing. He is just walking, his hands empty, his head bowed. Some scholars say he is a servant, or perhaps a prisoner. But I look at that figure, and I think of the soldiers on the mountain. He is not carrying tribute. He is carrying himself. And that is the hardest thing to carry of all. The carving is small, easy to miss. Most visitors to Persepolis walk past it without stopping. They are drawn to the massive columns, the winged bulls, the grand inscriptions. But the empty-handed figure stands there, silent, patient, waiting for someone to notice. I noticed him, and I have not forgotten. He reminds me that history is not only made by those who carry treasures. It is also made by those who simply keep walking. And now, in the quiet of your room, I want to invite you to imagine that you are that figure. Not the king, not the general, not the hero of 1,000 stories. Just the one who walks, empty-handed, through the snow. The wind is cold. The path is steep. But you are not rushing. You are not fighting. You are simply placing one foot in front of the other, breathing, existing. It is enough. There is a term in mountaineering that I find beautiful: rest step. It is a technique used at high altitudes, where each step is followed by a brief pause, a moment of stillness before the next step. The climber does not hurry. They cannot hurry. The air is too thin, the body too tired. They take a step, then rest, then another step, then rest. It is a rhythm, a dance with the mountain. And the Persians, without knowing the term, must have used it instinctively. They were not machines. They were men who understood that the only way to cross a high pass is to accept the slowness, to make peace with the shortness of breath, to find a cadence that the body can sustain. I think about that rest step when I feel overwhelmed by the demands of my own life. I am not crossing a mountain in snow. I am sitting in a chair, speaking into a microphone, hoping my words find you. But the same principle applies. One step, then rest. One sentence, then a breath. One night, then a morning. The mountain is whatever feels impossible, and the rest step is the act of doing it anyway, slowly, patiently, without complaint. The Persians did not complain. At least, not in any record that has survived. But they were human, and humans complain. I am sure they grumbled under their breath. I am sure they cursed the cold, the snow, the endless climbing. But they kept moving. They kept taking their rest steps. And in the end, they reached the valley. There's a story within that story, a microscopic tale that I want to share with you before we let the night take us deeper. It comes from a later period, from a Byzantine historian who wrote about a Persian ambassador crossing the same mountain centuries after the great campaigns. The ambassador was old, his knees weak, his lungs fragile. His attendants begged him to stop, to rest, to turn back. But he refused. He said, "If I stop now, I will never start again. So I will keep going slowly until I cannot go any further." He crossed the pass. It took him 5 days longer than expected. He arrived in the valley pale and trembling, but alive. And when his hosts asked him why he had pushed himself so hard, he said simply, "Because the mountain does not wait, and neither does my heart." I think that ambassador understood something that the young soldiers, in their vigor, may have missed. Crossing a mountain is not a physical act. It is an act of will. It is a decision made in the deepest part of the self, a decision that says, "I will not be stopped by the cold. I will not be stopped by the height. I will not be stopped by the fear." And that decision, once made, becomes a kind of anchor. It holds you steady when the wind tries to push you back. So now, as the night wears on and your eyelids grow heavy, I want you to make that decision, not for a mountain, but for your own sleep. Decide that you will let go of the day. Decide that you will trust the darkness. Decide that you will rest, not because you have to, but because you choose to. And in that decision, you will be joining the long line of travelers, from Persia to Rome to wherever you are now, who have chosen to keep moving, even when the path was hard. I have one more fragment to offer you, a piece of a letter written by a Persian soldier to his wife. The letter was discovered in a clay jar, buried under the ruins of a fort near the mountain. It is dated to the same period as the Great Crossing. The soldier writes, "My dearest, I am writing this by a fire that is barely warm. The wind is howling outside. My fingers are stiff, but I wanted to tell you that I saw a star tonight through a break in the clouds. It was bright, like your eyes when you laugh, and I knew then that I would come home." The letter ends there. It is unfinished. Perhaps he was called away. Perhaps the fire died. Perhaps he was lost on the mountain after all. We do not know. But the star he saw, that single point of light, is still there. It shines down on us now, on your roof, on the trees outside your window, on the roads and the rivers and the sleeping cities. That star does not know about the soldier. It does not know about his love or his fear. But I know, and now you know, and that is enough. So let the soldier and his star fade into the background of your mind. Let the almond tree stand in the valley, its roots deep, its branches reaching for the sky. Let the empty-handed figure on the stone wall keep walking, step by step, rest by rest. And let yourself, finally, be still. The night has wrapped itself around you, soft and dark and patient. There is nothing left to carry. There is nothing left to prove. You have listened, and that is a gift. You have stayed, and that is a kindness. And now, as the last embers of the fire gutter out, as the wind settles into a whisper, as the world holds its breath, you can close your eyes and join the long sleep of the mountains. But before you do, let me tell you this one last thing. It is not a fact. It is not a story. It is a feeling, a warmth, a quiet understanding. The Persian soldiers, in crossing that mountain, did not know that someone hundreds of years later would be thinking of them. They did not know that their footsteps would echo in a room far away on a night like this. But they do. They echo now, and you have heard them. Sleep well, sleep deep, and know that the mountain is always there, waiting for you if you ever choose to climb it. But tonight, it is enough to rest. Tonight, it is enough to be here with me in the quiet of the telling. Good night once more, and may the stars guide your dreams. If you are still here, if your mind has not yet drifted fully into that warm and distant place where dreams begin, then let me share a quieter story, one that does not demand attention, but simply waits, like a stone in the snow. It is about the things the soldiers carried, not only on their backs, but in their hearts. And it is about the things they left behind. The Persian army did not march with only weapons and provisions. They carried something else, something that weighed nothing, and yet could break a man faster than any storm. They carried memory. Every soldier, even the youngest, had a village in his mind, a face, a voice. He had the smell of bread baking in his mother's oven, the sound of children laughing in a courtyard, the feel of a woman's hand in his own. These were invisible burdens, but they were the heaviest of all. Because when the snow fell and the air thinned and the path disappeared, it was not the sword or the shield that kept a man moving. It was the promise of return, the hope that he would once again see those faces, smell that bread, feel that hand. There is a word in Persian, old and rarely used now, delmun. It means something like the heart's heaviness, the longing that sits in the chest like a stone. The soldiers felt delmun deeply. They did not speak of it, not in letters, not in campfire songs. But it was there, a constant companion, as real as the wind. And oddly, it helped. It gave them a reason to endure, because to stop was to surrender not only the body, but the heart's desire. And that was a surrender no man wanted to make. I once read an account, not from a historian, but from a poet who lived centuries after the Persian Empire had crumbled. He wrote about a traveler who found a small clay tablet on a mountain pass, half buried in the scree. The tablet was cracked, the writing barely legible. But the traveler, who knew the old script, deciphered a few words. They were not a military order or a record of supplies. They were a prayer, a simple prayer scratched by a soldier's trembling hand. Let me see the almond blossom one more time. That is all. No request for victory. No plea for glory. Just the almond blossom, a small white flower that blooms in the valleys of Persia in early spring. The soldier did not ask to live forever. He did not ask to be remembered. He asked only for one more spring, one more moment of beauty, one more chance to stand under a tree and watch the petals fall like snow. I think about that prayer when I feel the weight of my own days. I am not a soldier. I am not crossing a mountain in snow. But I have my own almond blossoms, small things that I hope to see again. The light on a window at dusk, the sound of rain on a roof, the warmth of a cup in my hands. And I wonder if the soldier's prayer is really everyone's prayer, written in a language we all understand, even when we cannot speak it. The almond tree itself is a patient thing. It does not rush to bloom. It waits through the cold, through the long dark months, until the moment is right. And then, almost overnight, it covers itself in white, as if the snow had come back but softer, kinder. The Persians knew this. They planted almond trees along the trade routes near the foot of the mountains so that travelers would see them and remember that spring always returns. It is a small act of faith, a promise written in bark and petal. Now, in the quiet of your room, I want you to imagine that you are standing at the base of that mountain, looking up at the pass. The snow is deep, the wind is sharp, but behind you, just visible through the haze, is an almond tree. It is not in bloom yet. Its branches are bare, dark against the gray sky. But you know that beneath the bark, beneath the frozen ground, the sap is moving. The tree is waiting, and you are waiting with it. The soldiers must have felt that way too. They must have looked back sometimes and seen the tree and known that if they survived, they would see it bloom again. And if they did not survive, well, the tree would bloom anyway, indifferent to their fate. There's a kind of comfort in that indifference. It reminds us that the world does not depend on our suffering. It continues, beautiful and cold and alive, whether we are there to see it or not. There is another story, this one from a medieval Persian historian, about a young soldier who was lost on the mountain during a blizzard. His comrades searched for him for 3 days. They found him huddled under a rock, not far from the pass. He was alive, barely. When they asked him how he had survived, he said, "I listened to the wind. It told me to keep breathing." They thought he was delirious, and perhaps he was. But I like to think that the wind did speak to him, not in words, but in rhythm, in the steady push and pull of air that never stops. He had learned to match his breathing to that rhythm, to become part of the mountain's own breath. And that is how he lived. Breathing is the most ordinary thing we do. We do it without thinking, thousands of times a day. But at high altitude, on a mountain pass in winter, breathing becomes a conscious act, a labor. Each inhalation feels pitifully small, as if the lungs have shrunk. The soldiers had to learn to breathe slowly, deeply, deliberately. They had to resist the urge to gasp, because gasping wastes energy. They had to find a pace that the body could sustain. And in that finding, they discovered something about patience, about the value of taking only what the air offers, no more, no less. I remember a story from a modern mountaineer, not Persian, but Scottish, who climbed in the Himalayas. He wrote that the most important lesson he learned was to breathe like a child again. Not the anxious breathing of an adult, always in a hurry, always trying to do too much, but the slow, steady breathing of a child who has never learned to worry. He said that when he breathed that way, the mountains seemed to soften. The cold became less bitter. The fear became a distant thing, like a bird flying away. The Persian soldiers, of course, did not have a mountaineer's manual. They had only their bodies and their will. But they must have discovered the same truth, the same secret. When you breathe slowly, you become slow. And when you are slow, you can endure. The mountain is not impressed by speed. It respects only persistence. And so they plodded, step by step, breath by breath, through the snow. They learned to read the wind, to watch for the signs of a coming storm. They learned to trust the gray light of the overcast sky, which meant the snow was holding back. They learned to walk in each other's footsteps, because breaking trail is the hardest work. They took turns at the front, each man doing his share, then falling back to rest, to breathe, to let another take the lead. I think there is a lesson in that, too, for the quiet hours of the night, when sleep feels far away, when the mind is restless and the body tense. You can imagine that you are not alone. You are part of a long line of sleepers, stretching back through the centuries. Each one of them, in their own time, faced the same struggle. They lay down in the dark, in tents or huts or under open skies, and they breathed slowly, and they let go. And you can do the same. There is a term in Persian that I find soothing, sabr. It means patience, but not the kind of patience that waits without feeling. It is the patience that endures, that carries the weight without breaking. The soldiers had sabr. They needed it. They leaned on it like a staff. And when you lean on sabr, it does not break. It holds. Now, as the night deepens, I want to return to that empty-handed figure on the stone wall at Persepolis. I told you earlier that he is walking without carrying anything, but perhaps that is not quite right. Perhaps he is carrying something invisible. He is carrying the memory of every step he has taken, every breath he has drawn, every moment of sabr he has practiced. He is carrying the weight of all the nights he has spent under the stars, alone or with others, waiting for the dawn. And that weight, though invisible, is real. It is the weight of a life lived fully, or at least lived truly. I think about that figure when I am tired. I imagine him walking slowly, not because he is weak, but because he has learned the rest step. He pauses, breathes, looks around. He sees the mountains in the distance, the clouds gathering, the sun setting. He does not hurry. He knows that the path will still be there in the morning. And so he allows himself to be still, even while moving. You can do that, too, tonight. You can be still while moving if you allow your mind to drift without rushing. You can take a rest step into sleep, a pause between waking and dreaming, a moment of pure, gentle emptiness. It is not falling asleep. It is choosing to rest, to breathe, to let the mountain of the day become a shadow in the distance. The Persians called the mountains ka, a word that sounds like the wind itself, low and rumbling. They did not worship the mountains, but they respected them. They offered prayers, sometimes small offerings like a piece of bread or a coin, left at the base of a pass. These were not bribes. They were thank yous, acknowledgments that the mountains had allowed them to pass. And when they reached the valley, they looked back and whispered a word of gratitude. They did not boast. They did not say they had conquered anything. They said, "We are still here. We are still here." That is the story of every human life, compressed into 4 words. We are still here, after the snow, after the thin air, after the long walk. And that is enough. Now I will let the silence grow, just for a moment, so you can feel the weight of that sentence settle. We are still here. You are still here. In this room, under this night, listening to words that are already fading into memory. And that is beautiful. That is the quiet triumph of being alive. If you want, you can take a slow breath now. In through the nose, soft and deep. Hold it for a count of 3. And then let it out slowly, through your mouth, as if you were blowing a feather into the air. That is your rest step. That is your saber. That is the prayer of the empty-handed figure, the soldier, the almond tree. Good night once more, but not in a way that closes the door. Good night in a way that leaves it ajar, so that if you need to come back, you can. The mountain will be waiting. The snow will be falling somewhere in a distant pass. And the story will continue in your own breath, in your own dreams. Until tomorrow, or until the next time you listen, stay soft, stay slow, stay still. You are still here. That is enough, I think. But the story does not quite end there, because the night is still young, and the mountain still stands. And if you will allow me, I would like to tell you one more thing about those soldiers, something that has to do with the stars. At high altitude, the sky becomes a different thing altogether. It is not the soft, hazy dome we see from the valleys. It is a hard, black vault, so clear that each star seems to have its own voice, its own pulse. The air is thin and dry, and the light from the stars travels without distortion, reaching the eye with a sharpness that can almost hurt. The Persian soldiers, walking through the passes in winter, must have looked up often. They had no maps, no compasses in the modern sense, but they had the stars. They knew that the North Star, which they called the nail of the sky, stayed fixed. They knew that the constellation of the Bear, which they called the Seven Thrones, turned slowly through the night. And they used these lights to guide their steps, to keep them moving in the right direction, even when the path was buried under snow. I imagine a young soldier, perhaps the one we spoke of earlier, the one who survived by listening to the wind. On his third night on the mountain, after his comrades had found him and wrapped him in blankets, he lay awake under the open sky. He was too weak to walk, but not too weak to watch, and he saw the stars wheel above him, indifferent and beautiful. He told himself that each star was a lamp, lit by someone he loved, far away in the lowlands, his mother, perhaps, or his sister. They were praying for him, and their prayers took the form of light. It is a strange comfort, but a real one, to believe that you are seen, even from an impossible distance, even by a light that has traveled for centuries to reach you. You can try that tonight, if you like. Lie back, imagine that the stars are not cold points of fire, but warm lamps, lit for you. It does not matter if it is true. What matters is the feeling, the quiet assurance that you are held in some vast, gentle attention. The soldiers had that too. They called it the gaze of the heavens, and they believed that it could bless a journey or curse it. They did not try to control it. They only tried to be worthy of its kindness. Now, let me tell you about the camps they built. At the end of a day of walking through snow, the soldiers would find a sheltered spot, perhaps in the lee of a rock or at the edge of a frozen stream. They would dig a hollow, tamp down the snow, and pitch their tents. The tents were made of goat hair, woven thick and dark. They smelled of smoke and animal and years of use. Inside, they would light a small fire, using dry brush if they could find it, or else a special fuel they carried, dried dung mixed with resin, which burned slowly and gave off a steady, almost smokeless flame. The fire was not for warmth alone. It was for company. The flames danced, and the soldiers gathered around them, and they talked in low voices, or they sang. The songs they sang were old, older than the empire. They were the songs of the steppes, of the wandering tribes from whom the Persians had learned to ride and fight. The melodies were simple, often just a few notes repeated, like the wind through a narrow gorge. The words spoke of horses and rivers, and the faces of loved ones left behind. The soldiers did not sing to be heard. They sang to fill the silence, to remind themselves that they were still human, still capable of making something beautiful out of breath and memory. There is a particular song, I am told, that was sung on the coldest nights. It had no words at all, only a hum, a low, steady drone that rose and fell like the breathing of a sleeping animal. The soldiers would hum it together, and the sound would vibrate in their chests, and they would feel the cold retreat a little, not from the body, but from the spirit. That humming was a kind of prayer, a way of saying, we are here, we are together, we will endure. I think about that hum when I cannot sleep. I try to produce it myself, a loam deep in the throat. It is surprisingly calming. It slows the breath, steadies the heart. It is like the sound of a distant engine or the purring of a cat. The soldiers knew this, even if they did not have a word for it. They used their own bodies as instruments of comfort. And then, after the song, after the fire died to embers, they would sleep. They slept in their clothes, wrapped in woolen cloaks, their boots tucked under their heads to keep them from freezing. They slept close together, sharing warmth, their backs against each other like a wall of flesh. They did not dream, most of them. They were too tired. But if they did dream, they dreamt of green valleys, of rivers running full, of the smell of spring. They dreamt of home. I want to tell you a small, humble story about a mule. Not a soldier, not a general, just a mule. The Persian armies used thousands of pack animals to carry supplies up the passes. The mules were short, sturdy, patient. They did not complain, not in any way we would understand. But they had their own wisdom. A mule knows when the snow is too deep to cross. It will stop, plant its feet, and refuse to move. No amount of whipping or pleading will change its mind. The soldiers learned to respect that refusal. They would stop, too, and look at the snow, and realize that the mule was right. It would find another way, or they would wait. There's a lesson in the mule's stubbornness. It is the lesson of listening to the body. The body knows its limits, just as the mule knows the depth of the snow. The soldiers had to learn to hear that quiet voice, the one that says, enough, rest, not yet, and they had to obey it, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom. You can do that too tonight. If your body is telling you that it is tired, that it wants to stop thinking, stop worrying, stop planning, then listen. Let it be the mule. Let it plant its feet. And then let yourself wait. I remember a passage from an old Persian text, a book of advice for travelers. It said, do not curse the mule. It carries your life. Do not curse the mountain. It teaches you patience. Do not curse the cold. It sharpens your senses. And when you reach the inn, do not curse the wind. It has been your companion for days, and it will be your companion again. That advice, I think, is good for any night, any journey. It is a reminder that everything we encounter, even the difficult things, is part of the path. And the path is not something to be conquered. It is something to be walked, step by step, breath by breath. There is another figure I want to tell you about, one I came across in a museum, in a small room with no windows. It is a clay relief, broken at the edges, showing a line of soldiers marching. They are not the grand soldiers of Persepolis, not the immortals with their golden robes. These are ordinary soldiers, perhaps from a later time, the Sasanian era. They wear simple tunics and caps. They carry spears and shields. But the most striking thing about them is their faces. They are not looking at the enemy. They are not looking at the king. They are looking at each other. One soldier has his hand on the shoulder of the man in front of him, as if to steady him. Another is turned slightly, speaking to the man behind. It is a scene of mutual care. They are not heroes, they are brothers. That is what the crossing of the mountains was in the end. It was not a feat of individual courage. It was a feat of shared endurance. The soldiers held each other up, literally and figuratively. They shared their water, their bread, their warmth. They did not leave the wounded behind, not if they could help it. They carried them on stretchers made of cloaks and poles. They knew that tomorrow they might be the one carried. And so I invite you, in the quiet of this night, to think of the people who carry you. The friends, the family, the strangers who have held you up without your knowing. And if you can, think also of the people you carry, the ones who lean on you, perhaps without ever saying it. That is the true network of the human journey. It is not a line of solitary walkers. It is a tangled web of hands and breath. The Persian soldiers had a saying, passed down through the generations. One hand alone cannot clap, but two hands make a sound that reaches the sky. They meant that no one crosses alone, not even the king, not even the weakest. We all need another hand, another voice, another breath to match our own. Now, as we near the end of this telling, I want to take you back to that empty-handed figure on the wall. I have thought about him many times, and I have come to believe that his emptiness is not a lack. It is a fullness. He is not carrying a weapon, a bag, a tool. He is carrying nothing, because he has learned that the only thing he truly needs is already inside him. His breath, his integrity, his willingness to walk. There's a Zen story, I think, that goes something like this. A student asks the master, "What is the secret of enlightenment?" The master says, "When I walk, I walk. When I sit, I sit. Do not wobble." The Persian soldier on the wall is like that. He is not trying to be something else. He is not pretending to be a hero. He is simply walking with nothing in his hands because he has let go of everything he does not need. You can do that too tonight. Let go of the thoughts you do not need, the worries, the lists, the regrets. Put them down like a heavy bag at the side of the path. You can pick them up again in the morning if you must, but for now, let them lie in the snow, where they will be covered by the falling flakes and forgotten until the thaw. I want to tell you one more historical detail, and then I will be quiet. It is about the way the Persian soldiers prepared their food on the mountains. They carried with them a kind of flatbread, dry and hard, that could last for months. They also carried dried fruit, dates and apricots, and a paste made from crushed almonds and honey, a precursor to what we now call hava. They would soak the bread in water or melted snow to soften it, and then spread the almond paste on top. It was not a feast, but it was enough. And sometimes, when they reached a particularly high pass, they would leave a small piece of that bread as an offering. They would place it on a rock where the birds could eat it. It was a way of saying thank you to the mountain, to the sky, to the wind that had not killed them. I like to think that the birds remembered them, that the ravens and the eagles, those distant watchers, saw the small acts of gratitude and carried the memory of them across the peaks. And now, the snow is still falling, somewhere in the high passes of the world. The almond trees are waiting for spring. The soldiers, all of them, are long gone. Their bones are scattered, their names forgotten, their songs dissolved into the air. But the pattern of their journey remains, etched into the land and into the stories we tell. And you, lying here in the dark, are part of that pattern. You are the one who listens. You are the one who carries the story forward, even if only in your own quiet mind. So I will say good night one last time, but not the kind of good night that ends things. A good night that is like the closing of a book, with the promise that you can open it again tomorrow, or the night after, or whenever you need to walk those ancient paths again. Stay soft, stay slow, stay still, and if the wind speaks to you, listen. It might tell you to keep breathing. Good night. But wait, before you drift off completely, let me tell you one more thing about the silence of those mountains. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence full of small sounds, the kind that only become audible when you are very still. The whisper of snowflakes as they landed on a wool cloak, the faint creak of a leather strap contracting in the cold, the soft, steady breathing of men and animals, a rhythm that rose and fell like the tide of a distant sea. And beneath all of that, the sound of the mountain itself, a deep, almost inaudible hum, the sound of stone under immense pressure, the sound of the earth turning. One of the Persian chroniclers, a man named Ebony Mohammed, wrote in his diary about the night they spent at the highest camp. He described how, just before dawn, the wind dropped completely. The world went quiet, and in that quiet, he heard a man weeping. Not loudly, not hysterically, but with a soft, shuddering sound, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. The man was an archer from the eastern provinces, a young man who had left his wife and newborn child to join the army. He was not ashamed. He simply could not hold the grief any longer, and the soldiers around him did not mock him. They did not tell him to be strong. They simply moved closer so that their bodies blocked the wind. One of them put a hand on his shoulder, and in that gesture, the weeping stopped. Not because the grief was gone, but because it was held by many hands. I think about that moment often, especially on nights like this, when the world is quiet and I am alone with my own thoughts. It reminds me that grief is not something to be hidden. It is something to be shared, like bread, like water, like warmth. And the sharing of it does not weaken us. It makes us part of something larger, something that can bear the weight of many hearts. There is a word in Persian, dariyaftan. It means to understand, but literally It means to find the sea. The soldiers in the mountains, they were searching for a sea in a world of snow. But they found something else. They found the sea in each other, in the touch of a hand, in the sharing of a piece of dried fruit, in the rhythm of a marching song that floated up through the thin air, unraveling the knots of fear. I came across a poem once, written by a soldier who had survived a crossing of the Alborz. It was not a great poem, not by any standard. The lines were clumsy, the rhymes forced. But there was one stanza that stopped me. It said, "The snow was deep, but the footprints of my comrade were deeper. I followed them, and when I stumbled, I left my own prints for the one behind." That is the truth of it. We are all following and being followed. We are all leaving marks for someone else to read. And so tonight, as you lie here, you can think of the marks you have left. The small kindnesses, the quiet words, the times you listened without judgment. They are like footprints in snow, invisible now, but not gone. They are there, waiting for someone to follow them home. The night is deep now. The clock on the wall, if you have one, has stopped meaning much. Time is a different thing in this story. It moves in circles, like the breath moving in and out, like the moon rising and setting over the same peaks for thousands of years. The Persian soldiers knew this. They measured time not in hours, but in journeys, from one camp to the next, from one meal to the next, from one breath to the next. I want to tell you about the last camp they made before descending into the valley. It was on a ledge, barely wide enough for the men to lie side by side. Above them, the peak still held the last light of the sun, a pale gold that faded slowly into violet and then into black. The stars came out, not one by one, but in an avalanche of light. The soldiers looked up and saw the same stars their ancestors had seen, the same patterns, the same stories. And they knew that, in that moment, they were a part of a long chain, a thread of human experience that had no end. One of the officers, a veteran of many campaigns, gathered the men and pointed to a constellation that we now call the Pleiades. In Persian, it is called Parvin, a cluster of stars that looks like a handful of scattered jewels. He told them that, according to an old legend, these stars were the tears of a mother who had lost her children in the mountains. Every spring, her tears fall as rain, and the flowers bloom. The men listened. They did not laugh. They were too tired for laughter, but they remembered. And in the morning, as they began the long descent, they looked at the first green shoots pushing through the snow, and they thought of the mother's tears, and they felt that the mountain was not just a thing of stone and ice. It was a living story. Now I will let that story settle. I will let the images drift like snowflakes, landing softly on the quiet surface of your mind. The soldier with nothing in his hands, the mule that would not move, the tears of a mother in the stars, the hand on a weeping archer's shoulder. They are all here in this room with you, not as ghosts, but as companions. You do not need to remember them all. You do not need to hold them tightly. You can let them go, like a handful of almonds dusted with honey, like a piece of hard bread softened in melted snow. They will be here again when you need them. And so I say good night, not as an ending, but as a pause. A breath drawn in, held for a moment, and then released. The story of the Persian soldiers crossing the mountains in snow and thin air will go on, as it has for centuries, in the wind, in the roots of the almond trees, in the quiet patience of the mules. And it will go on in you, in your breathing, in your stillness, in the small, unnoticed acts of tenderness that you carry through your own days. Sleep well. And if the wind speaks to you, listen. It might tell you to keep breathing. It might tell you that you are not alone. It might tell you that the mountains are still there, waiting for the next crossing, and that you have already made it. Good night.